All right, everybody. Well, it's really great to have you along the path today. We're looking at Psalm 89, and hopefully you've had a chance to listen to one of the songs so far. Today, I've invited Dave Perry to come along on the path with us, but not in just a recorded talk, rather in a conversation that we're having. So I'm here in my kitchen here in Overton in England. And Dave, where are you coming to us from today?
I'm coming from the third floor of an old house in almost the exact geographical center of Canada.
Right.
If you measure with a tape measure from the Pacific to the Atlantic, the exact center is very close to where I am speaking to you from this afternoon.
Nice.
So I'm in the interesting situation of my wife Velma and I, who most of you know Velma, were renting the top floor of an old house from our own daughter. So if you ever want some interesting experiences, get into a situation where your landlady is your daughter. It has its moments, but we're getting along fine. And our granddaughters, who are both very special to us, of course, they live next door to us. And they've been away for a few days, but they're supposed to get back this afternoon. So I'm kind of hoping they won't come barging in the middle of this sermon exercise, but we'll see what happens. So,
well, we'll see if any of my girls come barging in, because that's certainly possible. Although I think one is asleep, one's in her bedroom, and one's in the bath. So I think we're okay on that front.
We're covered. Okay.
Yeah. Just for those of you that don't know who Dave is, Dave's a friend of ours from a long while back at Bible College. And we went to King's Bible College. He was the lead theologian there at the time, but we also knew him from way before then, back in Winnipeg days, around year 2000 and so on. Went and stayed at his place a couple times. And then he actually ended up living in Indiana for a period of time and came to Family Worship Center, where Rebecca and I were based. So we've gone back and forth for many years now. And so it's great to have him along. So we're looking at Psalm 89. And when I thought about this psalm, it's really long. It has a lot of verses, but it's really big. It has some really big ideas. And the writer of the psalm, Ethan, it's the only one that he writes, he expands on a few terms, which we're going to look at. But it's really a royal psalm because it talks about the king. It's also in some ways messianic because it points to Jesus. It's also a lament because of the way that it ends in a really sad note, but it's also high praise. So it culminates a lot of the ways that Psalms were written. And it's the final Psalm in book 3 of the Psalms. So it's really a big summary Psalm. And why I thought about looking at it in a conversation way is I didn't want to try to analyze, is it 52 verses and break that down. I think you'd all probably get sick of reading all that. So I thought, let's have a conversation. Let's pull out some key points. We're not going to try to go verse by verse because we'd be here till Thursday at this point. And right now it's Tuesday night. So we're going to look at some bigger ideas. So right off the bat, Dave, he jumps into praise big time. And he uses this term steadfast love of the Lord. I think it's 4 times in the first 4 verses, or 3 times, something like that. Can you just explain for us what's he really driving at when he uses this term steadfast love? We see it a lot in the Old Testament and certainly in the Psalms.
Oh, yeah. Earl's right. There's several terms that recycle in this psalm. One is steadfast love, chesed. Another is the word forever. And the idea of those two things, God's steadfast love and the foreverness of God's promises to Israel, particularly to the house of David. The psalm revolves around those ideas. Now, we won't read the whole psalm right now. I'd encourage, if you haven't read it recently, go back and have a slow, patient, meditative read through the entire thing. It's a long one. And you'll notice that about 2/3 of the way through, it's like if you're riding in a car, particularly where it's got standard transmission, and the driver shifts gears, you can feel it in the way the car moves. And when you get to verses 37 and 38, around in there, there's like the Ethan, the writer, changes gears. Now, for the first 37 verses, it's high praise. It's praising God, and he gives an inventory of all the glorious things God has done for Israel, and particularly the glorious things he's done for the house of David, and even giving Israel the gift of this king called David, and then David's heirs that come up after him. So like there are places in the Psalms, like notably Psalms 90 up to Psalm 100. And then again, it comes back around, if you start in Psalm 140 and go up to the end of the Psalter, 140 to 150, it's non-stop praise. And it's just every verse is almost just praising God in a different way, and telling the stars to praise the Lord, and telling the Levites to praise the Lord, and so forth. And it just goes, those are praise psalms, high praise. And the first 2/3 or so of Psalm 89 read like one of those. It's nonstop high praise. And there's hardly a cloud on the horizon in the first 37 verses. Well, good. But because the Bible is a sometimes brutally realistic book, we all know life isn't quite so sunny and clear, and there's times when things go wrong. And this Psalm 89 is very, very true to life and very in your face. And when you get to the gap between 37 and 38, there's the gear shift, because from 38 to the end of the psalm, it's a lament. Probably most of us will know what a lament is. The whole book of Lamentations, of course, is lamenting. And lamenting is what you do when you've lost something. It expresses grief. And you get psalms that will say, Lord, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 22 is a lament. Jesus quotes it when he's on the cross. And it's not talking about how great everything's going. It's talking about how horrible everything is. So
now with laments, Dave, isn't it true that usually they do in fact start with praise, then they go down and lament, and then they come back up and finish?
Oh, that's a very good.
They finish at a high point, whereby this one finishes at 52
and come back.
Yeah.
Now there are a few exceptions to that.
Right.
Probably Psalm 88, the psalm immediately before the one we're looking at, and then again in 89, and in 88 and 89, when it comes into conclusion, it's still in lamentation mode. So the challenge for us in learning to embrace the entire psalm is, how do I embrace both halves of that? It's almost like oil and water. How do they go together? Now, one thing that you need to factor in if we're going to engage intelligently with this psalm is the way that it looks back. The entire psalm looks back to 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel 7.
What verse?
Well, around verses 14 and following. If you want to read it, you can.
Yeah, I'm just looking it up while you're talking.
That's good. So, and particularly verse 16, 2 Samuel 7, verse 16. Your house, so this is God speaking to David. And he says, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure or established forever. Notice that word, forever. And if you go through Psalm 89, I'm sure you're going to notice how frequently Ethan, the author, comes back to this idea of forever. And then the very next verse, still in 1st and 2nd Samuel, your throne, David, shall be established forever. So twice in the same verse, this idea of forever comes in.
So is it likely Is it likely then that Ethan had 2 Samuel 7 on his mind when he penned this?
I would argue he did it. He probably had a copy of 2 Samuel on the desk, as it were, in front.
Some parchment there, and he was looking through it. And,
this, he can refer to that, and he is reading that, and then seeing these promises God gives David, which are clearly about something going on forever. And then Ethan looks out at life at the moment, and the state of things with the house of David, the dynasty of David, the heirs of David, like Solomon. And then, of course, after Solomon went off the rails, marrying foreign women who worshiped other gods. And then the kingdom splits in half after Solomon passes away. And it just goes downhill all the way, finally, to the exile to Babylon.
Yeah.
And so looking at this and thinking, what? Wait a minute, what happened to forever? And the psalm that Ethan gives us, it hints at answers, but it never gives like a neat and tidy solution. It almost reads at certain points like the book of Ecclesiastes, which is so focused on the downside of life, and death is all around and so forth. And there's parts of Psalm 89 that almost read that way. And there's no neat and tidy ending, like with the sunset and the violins playing or something like that. It kind of ends still in a place where everything is unresolved. So, for example, he's recalling 2 Samuel 7, the glorious promises of a forever kingdom.
Right.
And verse 39 in Psalm 89, you get this. You, speaking to God, Ethan says, you have renounced the covenant with your servant. What? If it was a forever covenant, how can God renounce it? What's up with that? Ethan saying, I know God even said he would discipline his sons if they disobeyed him. But this almost seems like more than just discipline, like you've renounced the covenant. And then the second half of verse 39, you have defiled his crown in the dust. So you can see the bewilderment of this psalmist, like what happened to the forever. And I think if I was editing the Bible or coming out with a new edition of it and giving this psalm a title, I would probably suggest something like bringing our bewilderment to God. Because I would argue that's what Ethan is doing.
Right.
He's pretending he's not bewildered, but he's bringing that bewilderment to the Lord. And there's something therapeutic in that. There's something neat, knowing God can handle bewilderment. God understands me when I'm feeling bewildered, and even hanging on to God when I feel like his ways in the world and in my life don't always make sense. If you have a loved one that gets sick and dies, what do you do? There's times when things don't add up. And so we could call this, I think, bringing our bewilderment to God.
Let's stop and reflect here a little bit, Dave, because you've dropped a pretty big idea, and that is about bewilderment, which is something that almost everybody watching this right now has gone through. And probably everybody is going through it right now in some way, whether it's a family member who's ill, or whether it's loss of a job, or whether it's your car broke down yesterday, or you've just gotten, you just been given a sentence with cancer, or whatever it may be. We walk through this all the time. And of course, one of the things that we want as humans is resolve. And that's where this psalm is so interesting, because it just sort of stopped. It doesn't plateau. It more down at the bottom stops at 52. And like when we watch a film because you see the bad guy, and then the good guy is going to win in the end. And if that doesn't happen, you're like, what's going on with that film? And it's like, it's really hard to find examples of that kind of film. Where here with this psalm, like you said, it stops. So where does this leave us then? Because that can't be the end of the story.
No.
We can't stop at bewilderment. So where do you think this psalm then points us to?
Well, okay, there's a couple of things we can say, and I think you're hitting at the meat of what we want to hit at, Earl. Part of the answer is in terms of our walk with God, aside from questions of the theological questions, would God ever renounce his own covenant? Leave that for the moment. I think we know the answer is no, he won't. But when it seems like he has done exactly that, what do we do with it? And I think Ethan's first answer is there's two things we need to bring to God. One is the praise that is due him. And the first 37 or so verses do that. It's almost 2/3 of the psalm is straight up praise, unapologetic, robust, aggressive.
Yeah. Get your guitar out. Get out your drums.
Praise. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that goes on for 2/3 of the psalm. Then Ethan sets an example of what we can do when bewildered, namely, you bring the bewilderment to God. So we have a trust in God, which enables us to say, Lord, I don't get it. This just, Lord, you're holy, you're faithful, I know, but this doesn't add up.
Yeah.
And then we need to be able to do that. And I think sometimes our own spirituality, our own way of thinking we need to do church makes us think we're not really allowed to be that honest. If I go even just a prayer walk on my own to say, do I have permission? Is it godly to say, Lord, I feel like you have let us down. I don't get it. And I think Ethan gives us, the author here, gives us an example of doing exactly that. So there's two things the psalm exemplifies or models that we can do, two things that we can bring to God. One is the praise due his name, and the other is our own bewilderment. Our own bewilderment. Now, another way the psalm helps us is in how it fits into the book of Psalms. Some of you may have study Bibles at home, and if you do have one, you'll notice the book of Psalms is divided into books. There's 5 separate, distinct books that make up the book of Psalms, and most scholars believe that, there you go, book 4. So we're at the end of book 3 in Psalm 9, and each of some suggest that the reason that the Psalms are organized into a 5-fold division is to recall the 5 books of Moses.
Okay.
And their way of saying, hey, Israel, you know what? These Psalms don't sit on a lower shelf than the 5 books of Moses. These have equal authority to the law of Moses, which is a striking thing in ancient Israel. The law of Moses was so honored and so holy. So for somebody to say the book of Psalms sits on the same shelf is significant. We come to the end of book 3, which that's Psalm 89 is the end of book 3. And if you read through the Psalms, it starts in Psalm 73 and goes up to Psalm 89. Pretty much every psalm in that section brings in struggle. You go and have a look at them. Read them slowly, meditatively. I don't think there's any exceptions in 73 to 89. There's struggle in every Psalms.
I've realized that as I've been going through them with the path, and those of you that have been following along the path all along, some of those were the ones that we started to hit on during the beginning of the Ukraine invasion. And they are just big time struggle, a real world struggle. And to be honest, I've skipped around a little bit because it's been hard to find ones that aren't repeating the same thing over and over and over.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And it's really struggle.
That's the lead up. The lead up to 89 is 73 up to 89, and it's very struggle intensive. Then you turn over, as if you can remember back in math class, Earl, when you and I were in grade school, right after 89 comes 90.
Right. Well, there you go.
There we are. Even you and I can understand that. That Psalm 90 is a very robust praise psalm, the entire thing. You have been our dwelling place in every generation. It's written actually by Moses. Speaking of Moses, Psalm 90, the heading says a psalm of Moses. And it's very robust praise, and you get the same kind of flavor in probably the next 10 or 12 psalms nonstop. It's praise. So I wonder if we can see a deliberate way the book of Psalms is constructed, because the Psalms of struggle and weakness are the lead in to Psalms of new praise.
Right.
And the Psalm, like 89, is a Psalm written in weakness, particularly the final third of the Psalm it's written in a state of weakness. And then you turn over and you're into God's strength. He is Israel's dwelling place. What an amazing promise. And you know, Earl, I'm sure we'll all recognize this. There's probably been a million sermons on this idea, and it's a good one. End of our strength is the beginning of God's.
Right.
And maybe many of the people that you'll send this out to that will be listening, they're feeling like right now I'm at the end of my strength. Well, if that's the case, the scriptures have some good news for you, because the end of our strength is the beginning of his. And you can turn that corner from Psalm 89 into Psalm 90, where God is your dwelling place. Now, Earl, I want to take us to the New Testament now. Is it okay if we shift gears a little bit?
You know, I was going to say one thing that Dave has always been really good at. It's taking wherever you are and looking back in the old, and then coming where you are, and then taking wherever you are and looking up in the new. So we've looked back, we've looked there. Let's take what we have from 89 and look in the new then.
Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
My cup of tea, Earl.
Yeah.
My great joy is how the whole Bible
exactly.
It's a coherent story all the way through. And we see this in my view in a very compelling way with Psalm 89, because if you get to the end of Psalm 89 and then just sort of stop there and you think, boy, what's up with that?
Yeah.
And what about the promises of David? And this idea of forever seems to have been left hanging from nothing. What happened to the forever? And what happened to these promises to the heirs of David? God made promises to David personally, individually, but he also made promises that would apply to his descendants who would reign in his place in later generations. And then that whole thing, particularly with the Babylonian exile, it's like the wheels came off the car. Okay. All right, fine. We leave those unresolved issues. We turn up to the New Testament. Of course, the beginning of the New Testament is the book of Matthew. And there's some fascinating ways that the book of Matthew introduces Christ and the gospel. One example is in the very opening verse of the book of Matthew. It says, these are the generations of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And this idea of the wording, the generations of Jesus, the son of David, that's modeled, of course, many of you will recognize it right away, from the book of Genesis, because the whole book of Genesis is built around these statements. These are the generations of heaven and earth when God made them. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of Abraham. You know, that phrase that keeps coming back again and again in the book of Genesis. And then how does Matthew start his story? These are the generations of Jesus. So by beginning his story of Christ the way he does, Matthew is telling his readers, guess what, folks? We're into a new Genesis, a new beginning to all things. And it's revolves around this person, Matthew says, whose name is Jesus. Then he identifies Jesus in two ways, side by side. He's the son of David.
Right.
Remember the house of David, and all the promises to the heirs of David. And then he's also, Jesus, that is the son of Abraham. So Jesus is, says Matthew, the son of the covenant, because the covenant began with Abraham, but he's also a son of Israel's greatest king, David, and Jesus, then inherits the crown that belonged to David. So what in Psalm 89, we last see this crown in the dust. Remember that?
Yeah.
Ethan says that God has taken David's throne and his crown and thrown it into the dust. Well, the crown has come back and it's being worn by Jesus. And so it's like the story picks up anew with Jesus as the heir of David. He's the king, and he's the son, says Matthew, he's the son of David. So the promises God made to David and to David's heirs. Now, when you get to the book of Matthew, there is at long last a faithful partner for God on earth.
Right.
Of the old covenant, God himself was always faithful to the covenant from his end of the deal. But the Israelite kings and the people of Israel were so often unfaithful and disloyal. So the whole thing went to pieces.
So this is where then the key term steadfast love, God's continual love, continual favor, and also the other big term we talk about, forever, come back into play. Because if it's referring to Jesus from the house of David, he is steadfast love, and his love goes on forever, and he goes on forever. And so it's really bringing those two terms back into the limelight.
It's exactly what it's doing. The idea of the lost forever. The lost forever. You can probably write a book called that, or why don't you write another book called that?
Sounds pretty interesting. In my free time, I will get to that. Yeah.
In your free time, whenever that happens. The lost forever, or finding the lost forever, and the lost forever gets found in Jesus Christ. All the forever promises that someone could read the Old Testament and think, well, I guess that wasn't forever after all. Well, hold on. Not so fast, because God would, in the end, in his own time, send a partner on earth named Jesus who would inherit the promises from heaven. So you'd have a faithful partner and on earth both, and the covenant would be renewed, and it would indeed be forever. Now, I'm actually coming into the conclusion of my prepared thoughts here, Earl. So I'll just make one more observation from the book of Matthew, and then we can go back and forth if you like. I just mentioned something we observe in the very, very first verse of the book of Matthew. Okay, Jesus is the son of David. That's the first description Matthew gives us of Jesus. He's the son of David, which means he's a king. And then, of course, in the very next chapter, who shows up? The Magi coming to find him who is born king of the Jews. So the monarchy is not dead. God has sent the king who will fulfill it. Now, what about the forever? What about the forever? Well, to see how Matthew picks up on Psalm 89, I sometimes wonder if Matthew is deliberately wanting to remind his readers of this exact psalm, because all the unfinished business that Psalm 89 leaves you with. Matthew begins with identifying Jesus, the heir of David, and then at the very end of the very final verse in the book of Matthew, what do we get? I'm reading chapter 28, verse 20. Everyone knows the words. It's the Great Commission. I will be with you always. And that's a synonym for forever.
Right.
I will be with you always to the end of the age. Well, there is no time longer than the end of the age. So the forever promise thing in the old covenant is now restored. And today we can tap into it. Like if we're thinking, Lord, I feel like the wheels have come off the car in my walk with you. Well, maybe they have, but God will revive it if we're
Right.
connected to Jesus. It always comes back, no exceptions. It always comes back to the central role of Jesus in our lives, and in the ways of God. So, Earl, that's how I see this. It's looking back to David, to the forever promises, being brutally realistic about the state of affairs in Ethan's day. The whole Davidic dynasty is shot to pieces.
Yeah.
When you see
However,
the big picture, God's faithful. When he sends Jesus, the son of David, he puts everything back on track.
that's really wonderful. One thing I've read about preaching is the importance of whatever you're preaching on, whatever you're speaking on, bringing that back to Jesus. And obviously, if you're preaching in the Gospels, that's not difficult. If you're in the New Testament, it's essentially not difficult. Sometimes in the Old Testament, it can be. In the Psalms, it isn't usually. But I think here you've laid out a different path of how we get to that point. Putting in those verses specifically from Matthew, which point back to this. So yeah, I think Ethan had a lot on his mind when he wrote this, because it's quite long, and it's really a wonderful summary of praise, which I know, like you said, book 4 then kicks into even more praise. But I also think it's the reality of those last 15 verses, which we can really hold on to, that, life does fall apart and we aren't the ones that keep it together, but God can put it back together. So that's really, I think, the big idea here. So I think you've really helped us explore that. I trust that those of you that have watched today have picked up some new ideas, maybe some new connections in the Word, and also with some of the other thoughts that are along the path that I've written out, just looking at this passage myself. Again, hopefully you've grown through that, and the songs have been good selections for you to worship to and to praise to, because there's a lot of different options out there for this particular song. So thanks a lot, Dave, for coming along the path.
Thank you for inviting me. I want to say hello to my friends there in Overton, particularly Chris and Carol.
Oh, there you go.
Look after us, really give us lovely lunches after I would speak in the church there. So good to indirectly connect with you. And Earl, you know what, just before I go, can I pray for your people?
Yeah, please do. Pray for all the people that are going to watch this.
And Lord, Earl and I want to join our hearts and ask for everybody that hears this Zoom, yourself faithful, where people feel at the end of their strength. There's something, it's the way that the book of Psalms is put together. It wasn't haphazard, it wasn't accidental, and that Psalm 73 up to 89 are about struggle and weakness, and Psalm 89 not the least. There's lots of praise, but there's also lots of bewilderment, and he's at the end of his strength, the psalmist that wrote this. But Lord, that becomes the stepping stone into the strength of God. So we turn over the page from 89 and we're into Psalm 90, which is a robust psalm of praise to God and an entry into the supernatural strength that God gives. And Lord, I pray for everyone hearing this, their weakness would become the place where God's strength happens.
Yes, Lord.
Commit them to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Dave. Enjoy the rest of your day there in Winnipeg, and I'll enjoy my evening here in Overton.
Okay. Lord bless you, Earl, and everybody else.
All right.
Take care.